Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Yellowstone, Season 1, Episode Dose. If you guys have not been able to have checked out the pilot episode and you just came on here and you're just like, okay, this is kind of weird, he's just doing this episode. I had done the review of the pilot episode such a X amount of time ago, and I guess now like YouTube has kind of caught up on Yellowstone, meaning that it seems to be a much more YouTube-ish like thing than it was when originally I put it on there, and it seems like the Yellowstone review of which that I did was way more a success than I thought it could have been. Like I thought that Yellowstone was actually pretty popular when I did that review, hence why I'm being honest. Like I thought it was pretty popular, but I guess now it's really achieved like some kind of something here. So, like I'm gonna be honest about this show. That's the one good thing about me is I like to eventually just tell people the truth instead of feel like I've watched something and didn't watch it or something like that. I'm gonna tell people in all honesty that I really, after especially this second episode, even though there's kind of a jumble of a lot of things going on in this episode, I like this show. Like, it's a really interesting show. Um, there is one thing that I may not understand where everything is kind of intertwining with one another, or I may not understand the context that everything is to be put into the show. Because I want to be honest with people and I want to just seem like, oh, yeah, I know what everything is going on. I'm kind of left in the dark, but eventually I think that I'll eventually try to intertwine and connect all these things together and figure them out eventually at some point in time. Like I'm just kind of in the fog right now. Especially, it also doesn't help that it's been quite a long time since I've watched the episode, and now I'm just kind of going into this second episode and just kind of like I didn't rewatch the pilot episode either. I just went in and I'm like, okay, let's just go and let's excuse me, let's go and watch this second episode and just talk about it. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about especially the pilot episode. Like right in the beginning there, where we have like Kevin Costner, who's in this huge like accident of a thing, and then he needs to take out his horse, and like that whole scene to me was just like, man, okay, I'm interested in this show. During this episode, I kind of like how it seemed like they slowed a little bit down, but there's also like this whole family that you have to like know what's going on with them. I think especially the one scene with both James and Beth together, where eventually James is to mention like he's like celibate and stuff like that. Like that whole scene with how that breaks down. I think that has got to be like the funniest scene in this whole like episode, and that's probably the scene that I probably like best. And I'll talk about that more in spoilers. So breaking down this second episode, or in the best way I can possibly break down this episode, it is kind of the aftermath of episode one, where there's questions to be asked about, of course, the dead body, which is to be put together within the first episode, which is, of course, to be John's oldest son, John Dutton's oldest son. So now there's questions to be had. There's people to be accused. And there are people that are also trying to eventually put people away. Put really just Jace away. Also in this episode, Jace is to have some interesting things going on with his character. Eventually having Jace kind of eventually go and do a tractor pull of this one this tree out of his seemingly yard to eventually stumble upon something that's very unique. And I'm like, okay, this is kind of fascinating. Uh, and I'll explain more in spoilers. I'm just kind of going in the very loose, cryptic-like sense to get people interested in the show. Uh, but we also have, it seems that Jace really having some tough times with his wife, who is Monica, in this episode. It seems like they're having some times where Chase is trying to do the right thing, but he doesn't know what that really is anymore. I think is a real consensus for Chase, where it's just like he's doing right, but maybe it's starting to get murky, and maybe he's eventually trying to uh, put his best foot forward here. But anyway, so Jamie is to eventually be going to the lawyers and have them kind of figure out what is going on with the case of his brother. And eventually they are to mention that there were three shooters present in this event, and that eventually we trickle off to more and more things. Where eventually it seems that Jamie is going to have to take this information back to John, because there is always this exchange of information going on. Beth is to eventually run off with Rip to, I guess, finally go on a date night between both of them. And so eventually they end up going and seeing some wolves tear apart some elk or some deer or something. And we'll see how that all plays out. So just a ton of stuff also happening in this episode. Eventually I'll get more into that. Really just like a smoother episode than I think the first one was, because I was like, man, like I was getting such like a headache in the first episode, because there was so like, especially when, like, no offense to the Jamie character, but when the Jamie character came in and like they started to show off with all this like these legal precedences and all this stuff, and I'm just like, whoa, like, man, am I gonna like understand this show, and am I gonna grasp the overall like thing of this show? And I felt like there was so much to be consumed within one episode. I was like, man, this is going to be a tough job for me eventually to try and review this and to get this out there. But I'm hoping that eventually I can just break it down per episode to episode, and I hope that everyone will be fine with that. Or eventually just because, man, one episode is a lot. One episode really is just like, okay, it's like that's one and done for me, because I think there's so much to consume in one episode that going and trying to review this in a season capacity, I don't think would ever be possible, because I'd just be like, yeah, there's so much going on, and like I would just say like, yeah, season one, this one, and like that's all that I could really say. So with that said, let's go into spoilers about this one. Let's just go further in to what's going on with this one. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about the timing into spoil this episode. So, so what I kind of cover, like I kind of covered bits and pieces about this episode. So, Rip is to eventually go and brand Jimmy Hudstrom's, and so eventually at one part of this episode, after Jimmy is to have a long day of basically being a crash test dummy, because we have John Dutton, who is Kevin Costner's character, jumping on this horse trying to break it in, and he just can't. He keeps continuing to get freaking chucked off the horse. He continues to try to get on it, but he just gets freaking whipped all over the place. And so John just cannot break this horse. And so Rip ends up walking in and is to just kind of ask John, it's like, well, hey, do you want me to do it? And so John is just like, well, you know what we really need? We just really need somebody like young with like rubber bones. And so they end up turning to Jimmy because he's young. So they end up just having Jimmy continue to ride this horse, and whatever he is to do, like, don't, like, they basically duct tape him to this horse and basically just have both Jimmy and this horse just run ragged until eventually the horse seems to have finally be broken and broken its spirits. So we just have them like have Jimmy like whipping and whipping and whipping like freaking just all over the place. It feels so horrible for this guy. And eventually, once he finally gets off the horse, he starts barfing because why wouldn't he? Because I'm sure like probably after a while you just get maybe nauseous of getting flung around for I don't know how long. So or maybe you get dizzy probably. So eventually Jimmy gets off the horse, and so Rip ends up getting on the horse, and it seems that the horse is willing to ride around and not go all wild. And so Rip is like, well, I guess this kid is a cowboy after all. Like there's something about it. Like there's something about him where it's like he finally got to this horse because he like eventually just rid him for as long as he could. So Rip is to tell Jimmy to go on and uh, take this horse, clean it, and whatever. And so Jimmy barfs once he's to kind of get to a certain point. So like yeah, like good on him. He finally kind of proved his worth. So Jimmy goes off and is to eventually now go into uh, the barracks with all these guys who are to seemingly be the field hands. And so eventually one of the guys is to turn to Jimmy and to tell him to take a shower. And so the guys are kind of like just getting annoyed because this guy is getting fairly smelly. And so Jimmy is like, well, hey man, like how about I give it an hour? Like Jimmy's trying to come up with excuses. The guy is like, hey man, you're starting to really smell. Like, come on, like get into the bath, like take a freaking shower. And so eventually we just have it to where they are to basically rip off this kid's clothes to force him to take a shower. And they find out that he's branded onto his chest. And they're like, you mother... So all of a sudden, Lloyd is to go and rip off his shirt, showcasing the same branding. And so Lloyd is to just tell Jimmy, it's like, well, hey, man, like, you can go and take a shower in the morning. There'll be plenty of hot water because, hey, I don't mind if there's cold water. Like, I'm perfectly fine with it. Just to kind of get into the craw of these guys to just be like, hey, F it. Like, why are you going to rag on this one guy when who knows how many other people have had certain certain things branded in their chest at some point. So that kind of finishes up that story. So let's go and let's talk about Jamie. So, like I said, Jamie eventually goes to the doctor who had done the autopsy on the one guy who had gotten murdered or had gotten killed. And so they say that they are to have, like, in this place, 3 shooters. And so supposedly now they're having to try to figure out what had really happened here and what had happened in this scenario. So eventually people are starting to ask questions. So Jamie is to eventually go back to John and is to say, it's like, okay, like, what do you want me to do? Like, this is what they told me, and so what do you want me to do? And so John is like, well, the doctor that did the autopsy report, is there any dirt on him? Is there any dirt on his nails? And Jamie used to say, it's like, well, he ended up getting caught once for smoking embalming fluid. And so John is like, well, like, I guess we're going to have to just squeeze a drug addict to eventually try and get like something out of this guy. So eventually what happens is they go and they take this body of John's oldest son, and they end up cremating him so nobody is to continue to ask questions. And so John takes his cremated son's body and pours it over his wife's grave, and because that's all he can really do to kind of just stop them from asking questions. And so eventually John is to go to this rodeo and talk to Carl Reynolds, and like, we eventually had this one thing that they're to say here, which I think someone weirdly ended up quoting that on Facebook that I saw, where eventually Carl is to mention, it's like, well, hey man, like, whoever was the first guy to ever put together a rodeo must have been the craziest guy ever. and and so John is like, no, like, I think he would be really interesting to go and meet. Like, it's just the second guy that you'd have to get really worried about, who decided to just go along with this whole ordeal. So, like, I thought I heard that, or I thought I saw that kind of somewhere put on Facebook, I think, because immediately when I heard this, I immediately knew what this story was. So somebody must have been watching it over on my Facebook feed. I think that's probably where I get like the best of my stuff easily, is just go ahead and just plop onto Facebook and see what everyone is talking about, and then immediately get out of there, because all I really do is just uh, kind of have to do like certain kind of photos for certain kind of outfits that I have to wear for certain thumbnails or whatever, so I can kind of I can prepare for that. But that's all I really do. Is like, oh, everybody hated Eternals, or everybody hated so and so movie, whatever random movie that came out this week, or everyone loved this new Netflix movie that came out this week. Oh, great, because everybody has an opinion, and like, I would just say like, hey, all my opinions are on this YouTube channel. So, so yeah, so moving on. So eventually John is to really just go to this rodeo to talk to Carl, to mention that there is some guy kind of uh, telling this story to people, and John wants this guy stopped. John wants this guy kind of like, have him stop telling this story, because John doesn't want another son of his to have to go to prison or die because of all this. So, uh, so pushing on. So eventually, Rip at some point is going to this one location to eventually go and notice that this one guy is kind of putting these, I'm assuming, weed cigars together, or some kind of weird, goofy cigars together. And so Rip is to go and choke this guy out, and is to uh, microwave this metal plate and some other item. And so this guy is to eventually ask, it's like, well, is it supposed to be arson, or is it supposed to be like a murder? And supposedly it's just supposed to be, God, where is the guy in here somewhere? Probably not. Um, Not seeing his face. It's probably Andrew Jackson. Or no, that doesn't make any sense. Um, yeah, not seeing it anywhere. I'm not going to try to continue to flop through this and waste time. So, uh, so Rip ends up killing somebody. I hope it comes back to him. It doesn't really matter. But speaking of Rip, so Rip is to eventually go on to talk to Beth and eventually try to ask her out to eventually go to some place that has music. And Beth is just like, you know what? I'm just so sick of you asking me to a place that has music. It's like, could we just go somewhere else? And Rip is like, well, how about we just go out and get drunk and watch wolves go and tear through an elk? And Beth is like, I'll drive. So they make it to this place, and so we we have this kind of like tease moment between Beth and Rip, where Beth is almost going to kiss Rip, but then eventually she jumps out of the car, runs where the wolves are, and scares them off. Rip runs to where Beth is because he's kind of afraid for her life. And then he ends up going like, whoa. And Beth is like, you should really try Zumba. Like, it'll do wonders for you. And Rip is like, oh, so I thought that line was so funny. But yeah, so uh, Rip is just kind of like, well, why did you do that? And Beth is like she wants to feel alive, she wants to take risks, and I can understand this character to where it's just like a lot of times all she does is just kind of stays in the ranch the whole time. So like eventually she needs to go out there and risk her life. So let's get to the Jamie Beth thing because I've covered Jamie and I've covered Beth. Now cover them together. So Jamie is to go and talk to Beth, and so Beth ends up making the joke to Jamie about him being gay, and Jamie's like, "Well, I'm not gay. I'm celibate because I don't want to go and produce a child that has anywhere close to a DNA that matches yours." I just thought that line was so hilarious. So to just like match any, so yeah, I thought that line was hilarious. But so like Jamie and Beth are kind of just talking about like family and stuff like that, and they're having this discussion. And I thought that this is the most interesting thing about this episode, just because we have these two characters that I kind of want them to like be more put in the show without having Jamie having to do all this like kind of lawyer stuff and whatever. I just want him to actually have like a life outside of his lawyer bubble. And it would just be nice to just kind of see that. And like I think Beth probably out of everybody is the most like fun character, but like I just don't think that she is to be put into the show enough. But eventually we're only 2 episodes in. So eventually maybe people do get their time in the sun, so to speak. So so let's talk about. Did I cover everything else? For the most part, because I think we're gonna have to just have Chase for last here. Yeah, I think everything technically is covered. So now to Jace, where it seems like his kind of story is kind of really interesting compared to everyone else. So Jace is to go and try to pull this tree trunk with his tractor, and Chase just eventually flips his tractor in the process. And so Chase just leaves his tractor like that because I'm sure it's too heavy to lift. So, like, can you even lift, bro? Like, come on. No, like tractors are like very heavy. Like freaking I've had in numerous occasions had to eventually like uncrate tractors from out of a box, and god is that a miserable process. So like tractors are ridiculously heavy, and like it's such a pain in the batucus to have to go and deal with them. So it's eventually, if a tractor is flipped over, I wouldn't have even bothered. Like I would have just been like, yeah, I guess it's gonna be a just flipped over tractor. Oh well, that sucks. Uh, Plus, God, there's so much like accessories and garbage with all those. Good God, what a pain in the butt. If any little tiny thing breaks onto a tractor, you might as well just freaking just toss the whole thing away. Because any special little accessory thing, oh my God. Uh, it's such an arduous process having a tractor, which I don't have, because I used to work in retail and I'd work in places where you'd have to go and uncrate tractors right out of a box. What a miserable process that was. Uh, and I don't know how many times eventually you would accidentally flatten tires by accident, getting them out of these stupid crates. What a pain in the butt. So, but moving on. So Casey is to eventually decide to use explosives to get this uh, tree trunk out of the ground, like the tree trunk that basically has just like the very bottom of the tree. Because I'm sure like all these roots are heavily like so far into the ground that it's like really tough to eventually just pull this tree out. So Casey uses explosives, ends up pulling his son off. Tate, I believe his name is. Possibly, yeah. Let's go with Tate. I'm not very familiar with all these characters yet, and plus also I'm not good with character names. People will understand that by watching every single review I've ever done in my life. So Case tells Tate to go and kind of like hold his ears and open his mouth really wide, like as if he's gonna bite a big massive sandwich. I would open my mouth wider, but I always had like jaw issues where eventually it'd be like a like kind of thing where it just kind of feels like when you open your mouth wide enough, you just have these clicking kind of things going on because I have weird jaw things, so I don't usually open my mouth fairly wide. Luckily, I don't have food that is massively huge for me to just be like, ah. Mouths are weird. So, Case goes on and is to try and open his mouth fairly wide and is to go ahead and shoot this explosive, which decimates the tree trunk, but then we also find that there's dinosaur bones in them there holes. So all of a sudden Tate is like, "Oh my god!" So he has like dinosaur books, and he's like, "Oh man, like what? So this kid is so fascinated by like digging up this dinosaur." And so he's just so excited about it. He's like Sam Neill from Jurassic Park, the main guy from the first one. So and he has these like when like Sam Neill has his like raptor claw and he's telling this kid how like he could get sliced and diced and whatever by this raptor. Kind of fun. So so Casey is to like just have his kid just kind of go willy-nilly trying to dig up all these bones. And so the kid is like, man, I wonder what kind of like dinosaur this really is. And so Casey's like, well, it's gonna take a lot of work to dig that up. And the kid's like, I don't care, like I wanna dig this whole dinosaur up. Let's see what happens. Uh so eventually John is to drop by and talk to Casey, and so John is to want Casey to tell his side of the story, and Casey won't tell him anything. And so John is like, well, fine. Did at least your brother see it coming? Like, that's all I want to know. And Casey was like, well, yeah, like he saw it coming. And so John was like, okay, that's all I wanted to know, because at least you can't give me anything, you could at least have given me that. So Casey is to go off and is to start looking for work. And so he ends up calling up uh, someone just kind of looking for work. And so eventually they're like, well, well, hey, like, are you gonna easily, quickly get your boots together and everything like that to just get ready for work? And Casey's like, yeah, I never unpacked. Like, I'm ready to go. And so they're like, good, good. So it seems that eventually Casey is to eventually call to try and get work, and that ends up just starting problems, of course, between him and his wife, because Monica is to now like be, I guess, the breadwinner, uh, with kind of Casey just being this kind of horse trainer that kind of has some kind of like side jobs, but there's nothing really truly there. So Monica is frustrated of just like by the fact of like, well, hey, is it just like, are you just frustrated that like I'm the breadwinner? And Casey's like, no, it's not that at all. Like, it's just that like I think Casey is just to need like something right now to just kind of like grieve and just kind of like, I think he's the guy that instead of like taking time off, like he's starting to get really itchy. He's starting to really want to go off and do something. And I think the whole tractor thing was just him desperately wanting to try and do something because he's starting to get an itchy trigger finger, so to speak, to want to go back and do something, to be involved in something. And just him just kind of sitting at home is just like he can't handle it. So eventually, both Casey and Monica are going and talking about this, like while they're driving along, to all of a sudden have some guy's trailer's meth lab explode right next to them, and so Casey immediately realizes that it was some meth lab, and so he ends up putting a shirt over his mouth. And you would have thought they would have just tied. You would have thought he would have just tied the thing to his face, but no, he's just holding it up the whole time. But I guess when really looking at it, like doing it that way, you could have it be that they're doing that for a reason. So eventually, it doesn't cover up their mouth completely, so you can still hear them talk at some points. So Casey goes over and finds a burnt, crispy man, a crispy critter of a man. And so eventually, Casey is to run over to Monica and tell her to call the ambulance. And so Monica is like, well, was there a family there? And the guy is like, well, no. Like, there's a guy who's almost going to die here, because when Casey is to find this man, like he doesn't have much of legs left. He doesn't have much of a body left, because he is just one fried man, sadly enough. So this burnt man is to desperately plead to Casey to just kill him. And so Casey goes, grabs his gun, and then does so with Monica watching at his side. And Monica also just covering up her mouth, because, like, you should not be dousing in to fumes. Kind of like, watch shows like Breaking Bad, watch a recent movie called Antlers that ended up coming out. Like, any time that you seem to have, like, a place that might have drug fumes and stuff like that, it's hard for your body to eventually inhale them in. So, uh, like I watched the first episode of Invasion, where we ended up having the deputy that mentioned that there supposedly was one meth lab that was right in the middle of some Chuck E. Cheese, and I was like, wow, that's quite a story. So. So yeah, so go ahead and check out Invasion. It's on Apple TV. If you don't want to actually go in there, there's a number of apps that I've probably used through time of whatever, and like that showcases through any number of stuff. Go into like a Google search find letter C movies and you can see seemingly unlimited amounts of things, or Fox HD movies and you can kind of see unlimited amount of things. Even Yellowstone, if eventually you want to eventually not have to skip the fact that you want to dare in fact not watch Yellowstone on whatever app that it is now, Paramount Plus, something like that. Like I know, like a lot of like I know my mother watches the show like very much so because she evidently likes it. For me, I'm just like okay, like I can watch this show, but the whole like I'm trying to draw connections of what's really going on, and it's just like I don't know. Maybe it's I like simplicity with anything, but I don't know. Like, and plus, there's always some times where, I guess, like the curiosity of a show like this, because I've seen stuff similar where I've seen like Ashton Kutcher's Ranch and stuff like that. So, pushing on. So let's just finish this up. So case is to have the police come, and so we have Ben Waters here and we have Thomas Rainwater. Um, Ben Waters is to be like the sheriff of this town, and so Ben Waters is to trade the pieces of gun with Case to say like, well, hey, if anything, like we'll say that I came here first. Ben came there first and shot this guy, and Casey didn't do it because it was a mercy killing, and because the ambulance wouldn't have gotten there in time, and would have like this guy would have like died horribly in pain. So like it was a mercy killing. So uh but then Thomas Rainwater goes and takes Casey, and it's like, well, hey, like we need to go through a sweat lodge, and like because we need to kind of take the evil off of both of us, and we need to eventually go through this sweat lodge. And I'm like yeah, I like this. Like, um, I like the whole fact that they end up having like. I honestly want like more of the Native American side of things, just because I think I might enjoy that more into this show. Um, like having sweat lodges and stuff like that. Like I just find that so intriguing when eventually we have like these kind of moments here, which you kind of get them kind of sporadically through a number of like random shows. Like eventually, Ash versus the Evil Dead. It sometimes they end up taking like peyote, and Ash has to go on uh, this kind of walkabout within his mind to eventually figure some things out. Uh, and so like we really have moments where I wish like there was a real like I wish there was a Native American like show, or I wish there was like a Native American like I wish there were more Native American movies that would be like coming out. Like when I like started to Google search like Native American like shows and movies and stuff, like I couldn't really find much of anything, or like the stuff that I could find, I'm like, like I don't know, like because I'm actually like a fraction Native American also, so like a very small fraction of sorts. So like I'm just kind of fascinated by the culture and I thoroughly enjoy it. And but I'm sure there's like obviously like no brainer things to go into like Dancing with the Wolves and stuff like that, which eventually I think at some point I had seen. Um, but it's been so long ago. And then there is some goofy parody movie like God, what was it? Hot Shots, the Charlie Sheen movie, where eventually there's kind of some Native American influence there, but it's bejokingly done. Anyways, pushing on. No offense to the Native American culture. I just want more of it. I just want it. I want more of that. Um, and I feel like that would be an interesting thing to be put out there, uh, because there isn't much out there. So pushing on. So eventually, Case is to go home, and is to again re-talk with his wife, and so uh, Case is just trying to tell Monica that he's trying to do the best that he can, but he's not really sure what that is anymore. And so Monica can really understand that, and so eventually their son is to be calling for Casey, and so Casey goes and is to kind of look through this dinosaur book, because Tate is just kind of excited about digging up more dinosaur bones. So I think that's the way that this episode eventually fades off. Like in my mind, where how I'm drawing all these people up and kind of and going into these scenes. I know that's like I don't like to perfectly do it the way the show does. I like to just do it my own way. If people don't like that, then that's perfectly fine. Go and find someone else who is eventually going to be super vague about this show. Just give you a thumbs up or a 1 to 10 scale about how they felt about something, and that could be fine too because those people have short videos, and people may like that more to just have someone who is to you don't know if they're truthful or not, or even if they've watched it or not, or even if they even care about the actual content. That it's just like, hey man, let's get 10 episodes out in one day and just see which one's the most popular one. Like for me, like I eventually just realized, oh hey, people like it seemed people liked this one. Okay, well it's something that I wanted to get back into anyways. Um, which that really felt that's what this was just me just going like, oh, people gravitated to this one, back into or going into this one, cool. Like because I wanted to just kind of find something to bring back and to just kind of like instead of having to go and dig for something new and taking forever to do that, like I wanted to go back to something that I've already had done and either go further into it or finish something up because that's what I've always just kind of hoped eventually people would find something that I've done. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. uh, as far as Yellowstone, if this video does do well, I'm not demanding or holding any content kind of hostage. If this video just surprisingly does well, then I will continue to try and do this episode uh, kind of every other day, possibly. I think that this show is actually perfect to do around Thanksgiving because this is like a family show and it kind of feels like a really good show to do during November. So like, hey, I have no qualms about like, oh no, this show, like, no, it was like, okay, cool, this show, um, because I've liked certain shows that have a Western kind of flavor, and I think people, especially after The Harder They Fall, I think people are really gravitating back into like a Western kind of approach of something. Because heck yeah, like I loved movies when I was growing up, like City Slickers, the funniest movie, but just a fun film that I thoroughly enjoyed. And then I watched the other one, the sequel one that came after that. Like I was hoping there was going to ever be like a third City Slickers movie, but I was like, I don't know. Like maybe they ran out of stories or something like that. But anyways, like I don't think they're going to come back to it now. It would be a little bit late to come back to that. But it would be fun, right? So, with that said, I'm going to get the heck out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.